It is a different sort of pleasure for me to be here today with the first person that I have ever attended the defense of, like defending his Ph.D. Erda is here, and then my first student at the University of Washington, Didem, and then my last student at the University of Washington, Oscar. So this is kind of among my beloveds. It is very I feel a bit nervous as well, a performance anxiety among the future generations for someone who was left behind by their excellent work. It is an honor for me, and I'm also thankful to the organizers, Griffin and Julia. They were great help. It is a pleasure for me to be here. And Oscar really gave us a very good snapshot of converting Istanbul into a different city from what it used to be. First of all, this went off. First of all, Istanbul was a very old city once Ottomans came in and conquered and converted it into a city they wanted it to be, most probably discovering new opportunities and possibilities during the act of conversion. First of all, Istanbul was one of the most populous cities by the time, like after 50 years of the conquest, thanks to forced migrations into the city of different communities like Jewish, Christian of different denominations, and Muslims. So they created a microcosm of an empire that they envisioned it to be. Like, I mean, they were the protectors of the people of three books, not only Muslims, and they were also submitting them to their rule as they think it should be. And Istanbul in sources was, like in literary texts, always defined as a city honored by the presence of the Sultan, but also it was one of the powers of the Sultan that their seat was Istanbul, as a very ancient city. Which connects Rome and the East and the West, etc. This was all the two seas. They images come out from all literary and historical sources. Whenever Istanbul was defined, it was defined as the city between two seas, between two lands, between all these dualities combined in Istanbul. And Istanbul, this is, of course, today Istanbul is 15 million people, and it's overflown out of the walled city, which is the peninsula. It was one of the largest castle towns in the world in its time. All the walls going all around the peninsula, very stratified. And inside the walls, there were agricultural regions, etc. It wasn't like a densely populated castle town. Rather, there were districts, and most of the stories of Istanbul, Man of Istanbul, a project I struggle as if I'm fighting a bull for last 3 years to write a short essay on Man of Istanbul for a volume of articles, but most of the action was going on the northern axis from east to west. At the eastern tip, there is Topkapı Palace, which was built 10 years after the conquest as a second palace, 1463, and then the Fatih complex, which is towards northwest, which is a complex of mosque, health facilities, schools, and 8 schools, and other stuff. So there was kind of marking this northern part of the castle town, which was also the port of the city, which was a very important trade center in the early modern world, combining Indian Ocean trade with Mediterranean and the European trade. So it was an overgrown city. It was, if not the most populous city of 16th, 17th centuries in the world, according to the estimates. But I would like to talk about this topic of the panel, beloved city. First of all, we need to kind of explode this understanding of beloved a bit. Oscar mentioned beloved as an enemy, but it is more than enemy. When you fall in love with someone, First off, there is a conception of beauty, which would be described as an aspect of God in Islam as Jamal. And then there is a counterpart to Jamal, which is Jalal, which is wrath of the beloved. So beloved was not an easy object of desire, in a sense. Otherwise, it wouldn't be love. It would be kind of devotion, loyalty, togetherness, etc. But here, the togetherness is impossible in the idea of beloved. So just for this talk, I want to give you a few couplets. First, describing one couplet about the beauty and then the wrath of the city, kind of a thing, or its problematic phase. Nedim is a poet from 18th century, early 18th century, and his Kaside of Istanbul is one of the signature poems about this city, which had great influence on modern poets, Turkish poets as well. And it starts like, bu şehri İstanbul ki bi mislü bahadur, bir sengine yekpare acem mülkü fedadur. And it is saying that the city of Istanbul is priceless and matchless, and even one stone of Istanbul worth the whole realm of Persians. Kind of so, and then the poem written for a vizier, Damat Ibrahim Pasha, to beautify the vizier along with the city, goes on all the positive sides of Istanbul. And in this sense, it is a very rare literary production because Istanbul appeared kind of strangely. Before getting to the wrath part, I should talk a bit about the gendering the city, because Istanbul generally conceptualized as a woman, but what kind of a woman? Because this world cannot be a beloved, because it is too material in its essence. So how can we conceptualize a city which is the most condensed form of this sign or symbol of this world, which is material, which is cruel on us as created people in this thinking? How can it be a beloved who is constantly, it is just a torturer, its beauty is, so this is the parallel, I guess. This world with its beauty is a metaphor of the real beloved, which would be God. And city is one of the perfect setting to reimagine the beloved. The gender of the city as such, for example, Fakiri, another poet from 16th century, called the city with a couple of possible genders. Like he says, Ya bir simin kemerlü dilrubadur ki halka alem ana müpteladur. Ya bir mahbubdur bu şehri ziba ki ayağına sürer yüzünü derya. So what Fakiri says is Istanbul is either a heart fetcher with a silver belt, and everyone is infatuated with it, or it is a beautiful boy, this ornate city. Even ocean puts its face on his feet. So this is like a boy, city like a boy beloved, the best of creation in that sense, not a necessarily sexual object of desire, but an erotics of religious desire, let's say, a sign of that desire, comes up like that in Fakiri. On the other hand, Mustafa Ali repeatedly compared it with Egypt, like Cairo. When they said Egypt, they meant Cairo, Ottomans. And he says, Ümmi dünya ve şeker bahri ise Nilü Mısır, ebi ya ceddidur anun bu matar deryası. So he says, if Nile is an ocean of sugar and Egypt, mother of the world, then Istanbul is the father or ancestor of this ocean of pure water. So there, the city suddenly gained this masculine gender, because this is also related to the Sultan's presence in it. But then the city can be a woman, like a womb of a woman, where Sultan rises as a male, like the minarets of the mosques, kind of a thing, phallic symbol, a man sitting in this feminine realm. So Ottoman poetry, as it always does, and as Walter Andrews and others showed several times, evaluates all these possibilities. So there's very difficult in literature to find a gender for the city, even though the Arabic versions, like Arabic is a gendered language, unlike Turkish, and Ottoman Turks used Arabic a lot to describe cities like Medina. is a feminine noun. So even though on the linguistic plane it is a female thing, a city, in the works of poets it may be a male. But I want to read from here. I want to come to this critical approaches and give you a very brief example from another 16th century author who arrived Istanbul when he was 31 years old in 1524 and composed one of the only self-standing narratives in high literary prose on Istanbul, which is Evsaf-ı Istanbul, like the characteristics of Istanbul. And he writes, after describing cities, districts, and unruly people, good places, bad places in the city, etc., he comes to say this. Lakin fil mesel misali bir arus-ı hezar damattır ki acuze-i dehri bihude nihad gibi nice şuy-i şevherden arta kalmış ve kise-i kerim gibi nice kere dolmuş ve boşalmıştır. Ve yürüm yutarım didügün hezar senin gibi yemiş yutmuş ve yerini gayrılar tutmuştur. The city of Istanbul is respected and favored by all the people of this world. However, like the unthankful crown which is this world, the city is also like a bride who has been left behind by many husbands and gets filled and emptied like purses of the rich, and those who claimed her has been devoured by her as others take their place. So here we see the city as a old woman, a very common trope for the world in general in Islamic literatures, devouring people. Most probably these people are defined as men. So women are out of discussion. And it is an aside, but I am yet to see any description of the city by a woman author in the early modern period. This is a question in my mind, because we have, as Didem's work displayed, very important women authors in Ottoman period. They are yet to be studied more and attended more carefully. But from a cursory look, I haven't come across any descriptions, poetic or prose. Now, this kind of describing the city as a beautiful place, which is very rare, because I understand that is what Islamic poetry does. Material settings are generally kind of deceptive metaphors. This deceptive beauty of the world, they are signs of. So one should they testify the beauty or the power of the creator with their beauty, but they are deceptive. If you hang on with the metaphor, you may get really dependent on this material world. You need to transcend the metaphor. This is the path of the Sufi kind of a thing. You fall in love with a beautiful person to realize that that person is created. If you don't get to that stage of realization, you can be in this cruel love, constantly suffering. When I arrived Istanbul in 1983, it was just being released from the straitjacket of a military coup of 1980. I remember registering as a student whenever I entered the city at the first precinct of the police center, police headquarters, for example, and there were checks. And I entered also a very male world, thanks to the dorms of Boğaziçi. At that time, there was an increase in the number of students, and large halls on campus were turned into dorms. I lived 1 year in a hall of 27 people. It was like a military barrack. And this was kind of an education for an only son of a family from the provinces, like to learn the language and actions of man. But at those times, we were like really worshipping a poet, Attila İlhan, who ended up as an ultra-nationalist, but he had produced amazing Turkish texts, and mostly about Istanbul. It was kind of his first two books were on Istanbul. It was like the flaneur in the city kind of a thing, but from the poorer sections of the city. So back streets of the city was coming into life. And one of his poems I want to share with you, instead of a, beloved, city as a friend or unruly friend comes across in this long poem. I won't read all of it to you, but the beginning and last piece. But I remember as a member of eventually 7 people sharing a room with bunk beds, we used to memorize and recite this poem whenever we were, like, in a particular mood. It could be good mood, bad mood, etc. But what I am trying to show with this, I guess, is I am trying to imagine in my projects, like, how were those poems and the pieces of prose shared among Istanbulite men of an elite group, because the language that I have recited for you, very bits of it, is not very easy. It wasn't very easy for the ordinary people of Istanbul, which I am trying to write now. We don't have much from them. But this poem, I will finish with this, reading this, is very difficult to translate. And in front of Erda, who is a brilliant translator as well, it is a bit kind of humbling an experience trying my hand. But it starts with this striking imagery. Kanatları parça parça bu Ağustos geceleri, yıldızlar kayarken, şangur şungur ayaklarımın dibine dökülen sen, eğer yine İstanbul'san, yine kan köpüklü cehennem sarmaşıkları büyüteceğim, pançak pançak şiirler tüküreceğim demek yine ben. In these August nights, with their wings shredded, while stars are sliding, if you are still Istanbul, which shatters beneath my feet, it means that I will spit out piece by piece many poems. So in this, I choose this because here, how the city inspires poetry is given to us. Like, this is the only response to the city by Attila İlhan, who was born in Izmir, who is an incoming person to the city like myself years ago. And then the poem ends this way. Sen eğer yine İstanbul'san, senin ıslıklarınsa kulaklarıma saplanan bu ıslıklar, göz bebeklerimde gezegenler gibi dönen yalnızlığımdan bir tekmede kapılarını kırıp çıktım demektir. Ulan bunu sen de bilirsin İstanbul, kaç kere yazdım kim bilir, kaç kere kirpiklerimiz kasaturalara dönmüş diken diken, 1949 Eylül'ünde birader Mırç ve ben sokaklarında Mohikanlar gibi ateşler yaktık. Sana taptık ulan, unuttun mu? Sana taptık. If you're still Istanbul, if this whooshing sound pierces my ears is your whistling, it means then that I broke down its doors and stepped out of my loneliness that rotates like planets in my eyeballs. You also know it, Istanbul, how many times I put it down, how many times our eyelashes sharpened like thorns. In the September 1949, along with my friend Mırç, we started fires in your streets like Mohicans. We worshipped you, Ulan. I don't know how to translate this vocative, like Ulan. We worshipped you, Ulan. Have you forgotten? We worshipped you. So yes, Istanbul created, as Oscar first explained, how Ottomans converted this city into a familiar realm, but all these bits of poetry and literary evidence as well as histories, it wasn't a finished process ever. Even in the, like in this poem, Attila İlhan is in fact talking about the resistance of city as for the worshippers of it. Like, he wants confirmation from the city, kind of a thing. So it is a central question how certain cities in the world turns themselves or convince their inhabitants, visitors, that they are the object of their desire. They want themselves to be put into words. Like I put it down several times. You know it, Istanbul. Yes. So I want to finish there. I hope this reflects kind of a very fast, overview of literary Istanbul. Thank you.
I'm going to open the floor to questions, but I wanted to say a few things first Thank you. This brilliant, presentations. Oscar, your presentation reminded me. You quoted from Jafar Çelebi and how he explained. Was it Jafar Çelebi? He explained, started explaining the city from center to the periphery. Yeah. And do you think this is like a reiteration of this, concept of like the power structure for the Ottomans was horizontal instead of vertical, like Bernard Lewis? Leslie Pierce talked about it, right? So they situated the palace in the middle of everything. So if you want to reach the power, you don't go up, you go, in. Yes. So that was, I remember that. It's interesting that it shows up in Cafer Çelebi's poem too. Hocam, I think, yes, I think, we need to find more women poets like talking about the city, city of Istanbul specifically, I think, because Mihri talked about Amasya, remember? Yeah. So I think, do you think we don't have that because city is a male space? I mean, is it because it's like, it's not their world that the women are not talking about the city, they are not, or maybe certain genres, like for instance, they don't write Şehrengiz, but they maybe talk about it in Gazelle, do you think there's a difference in that? Or Istanbul is the major city that they cannot even like enter, like maybe they do it in provinces, but not in Istanbul. Do you want to comment on it, or should we just like, pick more questions?
I would like to reply to that. It may be our ignorance about what is out there. Women poets, we have a couple of poetry collections, but except for Mihri's, they are not really detailedly studied. Istanbul is a male space, yes, but I mean, poetry, literature was a male space as well. Its language, its tropes, all like privileged the male subject desiring. So women needed to step into this masculine posturing, in a sense, poking a stick into it by singing these poems as if they are man, kind of thing, using man's language, etc. So I assume they would have done it, but as you said, maybe the experience of city was very different for the elite women who were educated and using this language because they were more and more sequestered into their houses, rarely going out for bathhouses. There must have been an occasion for them to step out of the house, kind of a thing. So this limits the experience of the city, which kind of most of these male members of the elite had some access. They weren't like Attila İlhan go to, back streets of Istanbul. It would be a shame for them to be visible there as elite men. So city was restricted not only to women, but certain spaces were available for elite men as well. Being elite is defined by the castle, right? Like, I mean, it's a metaphor, like you need to protect this power. It is not spreading all around that easily, kind of a thing. Yeah. But I mean, this is a good question, and we need to look into it.
So maybe just to quickly follow up, actually, it's a great question because usually scholarship thinks of how, when you think about like power, in the case of the Ottomans, usually the closer you are to the center is the closer you are to the Sultan, right? In comparison to today's, that's the metaphor that Didem was talking about. When you go to a high rise, when the higher the floor that you are at is probably the more powerful you are. But usually this term is usually taught in relation to influences into the Ottoman Empire, right? So that logic of power comes from Turco-Mongolic ideas or tent camps in the Mongol world, etc. But something I think that Cafer Çelebi adds is actually we see in the 16th century how Ottomans are reconceptualizing power. And one of the ways we can access that is actually through poetry, right? So Cafer Çelebi is not just a random poet. He's the imperial chancellor. He's at the center of the empire. And he's right at the moment when the Ottomans are rethinking, or I think they are imagining how to become an empire of world standards, right? And so his description is really a place where he's not only describing this, but it's actually a place where we see it's being created and it's being discussed and it's being, probably as Selim says, it's being distributed among a certain elite, right? So this poet is actually really almost as the word poetry, right? It's poiesis, is creating something and creating meaning.
Yeah, That's great, yeah. Okay, so questions, Arda?
Thank you both for wonderful, inspiring talks. Beautiful to hear you both talk. I had two comments, more than questions. One was when we're evoking Walter, I think of Poetry's Voice, Society's Song, and when I was listening to you, I was hearing a lot about Poetry's Voice and less about Society's Song. So I was wondering if we were to fill in what the beloved city is. It's sort of an absence and a muse, and it's a literary trope. But can we get something more there? Can we delineate something more? And in conjunction with that, the second point was, I think about Gülür Necipoglu's work on Istanbul and a kind of cosmopolitanism as early as the 15th century. And I'll also evoke Bruce Lawrence's work on a kind of Muslim cosmopolitanism, in addition to Cemal Kafadar's notion of a Rumi identity, of an identity that's sort of emerging out of the city, the capital city, and as the empire expands in both directions. So less questions than comments, really.
But I mean, they are important comments because Muslim cosmopolitanism, in my work through literature, what I'm trying to say that it is a very limited form of, let's ask whose cosmopolitanism. Mm-hmm. Many people were forced to live together, like in Istanbul. Istanbul never had ghettos. And this axis, like the old Byzantine Mese, today's Divan Yolu, that street starting from the palace going to Edirne Kapı, which is the route of the campaign, campaign started on that route, left the city, they came back through that route. So it was a theater, but around this main artery, there were all the single man's rooms, janissary barracks, the market, the bathhouses, the mosque complex, and churches, synagogues, which are less visible, but they were there. And those people needed to experience it while elite was keeping themselves separate from them. One thing, who can ride a horse in the city? Kind of where you should ride your horse. If you get into the market on your horse as a learned man, for example, this was a very looked down upon behavior. You were showing off. You were you are not supposed to go to the marketplace first, and not with your horse. This is so there were many limits to such a cosmopolitanism, and those limits were necessary because there was such a mixing of individuals in Ottoman cities, especially. It deserves, some detailed comparison with India, Mughal and Iranian cities in that regard, the positioning of the elite, and when I said elite, not only governmental elite, learned elite, a different category who didn't live in the palace, who didn't live in the castled forms, they lived in their mansions in the city, different places, and they were the first target of the revolting janissaries or the esnaf or the ordinary people. So I think that is very important. With respect to the literature of these people, Fuat Köprülü, a very important founding member of the founding person for literary history in Turkish, wrote this brilliant article about the city poets as a genre. And they are found after mid-16th century. We have recordings of these in a separate genre of books, even with their shapes. And there is a lot of Istanbul talk, generally complaint, because the city was a place of suffering for them. It was difficult to live in Istanbul as a person, even if you're married. I'm again talking about the northern part of the castle town. Because the rest of the areas, I don't know, there were Armenian districts in the southern part on the Marmara Sea, Jewish districts on the Golden Horn outside the castle walls. So there were partitions which are being studied by art historians Gülür Necipoglu and Çiğdem Kafesçioğlu, but we still are not able to populate the city or capture the day-by-day experience of people and individuals. It is a difficult task. We are talking about hundreds of years of experience in the city. But this was a bloody city as well, as Mustafa Ali described in one of his poems. He said, the wrath of the Sultan paints this city to blood. It is an ocean of blood, etc., kind of a thing. So, but we can, there needs to be more work, that is to say, from the written, like rhetorics of Istanbul, how it developed, because it developed, it was there in every genre.
It's still very difficult to live in.
Yes, it is still beautiful.
Oscar, do you want to comment?
Maybe just to add also for your comment. So first about the cosmopolitanism, even if it existed already in the 15th century, it was also true that a lot of these policies were contested, right? Like it's not that everyone actually agreed with having a lot of foreigners or Greeks or different people living in Istanbul. There was constant push, and it's actually one of the things that has described the tension, that scholars have used to describe the tension between Mehmed II's and Tobias II's reign. And the other one that I think is important is, yeah, I mean, of course, and that's what I'm saying, it's an honor to have actually a paper that resonates so much with Walter's work. But one thing that I also was trying to do today is kind of add a chronology to this in a way, right? So a lot of those poems happen, as Selim say, in the mid-16th century. So really, one of the things I'm trying to find with Jafar Chelebi is what are the first ways in which people start talking about Istanbul? So I don't think there is many poems at this time. Rather, it's Avni has a couple of poems as Mehmed II. There is another Avni that has one poem in the Jami Nesair. And then there is Jafar Chelebi, which is the real first extended poem. And so one of the questions is how do we reach to that moment when this poetry starts becoming that society's song? Right? It's not that the Ottoman, as Selim says, it's a process that continues, not a fait accompli. It's not that Ottoman poetry was the same thing from the 15th century to the 20th century. So Walter Andrews has done a very good job at explaining kind of the ethos for the golden age, in a way, if you want to call it that way, or the age of the beloveds, to use his own words. But what happens before, and what allows that age to happen? And I think Jafar Chelebi is giving us a hint of that discussion that happened at the imperial power to turn Istanbul into what we know as Istanbul today.
Mm-hmm. And the latecomers are the best poets of Istanbul. Like, I'm not the children of the city.
Actually, Jafar Chelebi is from Amasya.
Yes.
Right?
Amasya,
And
right.
he came with Baisi.
Do we have more questions? Comments? Miriam?
This is probably too big, but I was wondering if you could just touch a little on patronage of poets.
In fact, it is Oscar's topic, but I mean, it is a very important topic. I would just say one thing. Patronage of poetry was as complicated as the act of poetry, because you didn't have a guarantee that your poem would be appreciated. So with each sultan, I think, this is totally speculation, poets had a period to get used to what do they like most. And then this is not researched yet. It can be researched by looking at the most favored poems by each sultan and the poems around them, because Ottomans kept a really good record of their literary production. We have a lot of poems and references on those poems in biographical dictionaries, for example. But it is a very interesting topic for me as well. Challenges.
And so maybe to add kind of the more prosaic level, at the beginning, I think the Ottomans were taking kind of reference to what's happening in surrounding imperial courts like the Timurids or other kind of Persian courts. So you see not like a patronage that comes from the center, from the empire, where they are either granted salaries or an entire year grant. Sometimes they are just rewarded for one poem, so it gives them money. That also gives connections. But also, as the empire grows, you see this being replicated among elites that they have their own. So just like the Sultan has 5 poets, maybe I don't have that much money, so I just pay for one. And so you can see that there are kind of tiny versions of the court among the ruling elite. Jafar Chelebi is actually one example. He's a poet, but he's also a patron of poets. But also something, and I will be very brief, that is interesting, this also transforms or is changed. Or that's what I actually would like to argue in a different paper, is that at the beginning, most of the poems were people that came from very powerful families. They have a salary, they have a position, and so on. But you see more in the 16th century people that were not necessarily members of a powerful family who start trying their hand at poetry and starts becoming poets by profession. So there is also a change between centuries when you see poets that are something else and a poet, and later poets that are poets and then something else. So patronage also becomes kind of more centralized and more powerful and more important.
I just add one thing to it. You mentioned about Mughal India, and one of the things that's very interesting there is that often people who are bureaucrats become poets on the side. So it's not just the fact that you have patronage of poets whose role is only to be producing poetry of whatever kind, but also people who have another function altogether in the bureaucracy, but poetry becomes as where their sidebar, and sometimes they're more famous afterwards for their poetry than for their labor.
And so actually, there's an intrinsic relation between bureaucracy and poetry, because poetry is, I mean, it's not that we imagine it today, which is like your personal curiosity when you are like 16 and you write about love because of the person you sit with, but it's rather the place where you show off a series of things, right? So all these poems you show off your language, you show your skills for expression, you show off your how concise you can be, but also your knowledge about the Quran, about Hadith, about the Persian tradition. So these really are like tiny portfolios for bureaucrats that show how good they are at language. And I think there is an intrinsic relation between the language of the bureaucracy and the language of poetry.
I need to add something because this is a very good point. Aşık Çelebi, 16th century biographer of poets, at the beginning of his biographical dictionary, says that poetry is an equalizer of people. Even sultans, bureaucrats, porters, shop owners became lovers thanks to this language that is given to us. Of course, this is an idealized portrait of poetry, but also my question would be, like, why this much poetry? Like, especially in the Ottoman centralized empire, we see like poetry becomes a part of whoever has a skill in this language needed to develop this language almost through this ghazal form especially. I have been writing an article, in fact I've written an article about this, especially like why so much poetry compared to Persia, Iran, Mughal, etc. We see a lot of different professionals also writing poems and compiling them and recording them. And we have evidence that this was kind of a part of all kinds of communication in private parties, gatherings. People like immediately singing a couplet was a etiquette, like high etiquette, like, I don't know, God, like he just spurted this out kind of a thing. So why in Ottoman Istanbul especially, instead of Baghdad, Aleppo, etc., this became such a play that facilitated? Otherwise, like, yes, it had many pragmatic reasons, but beyond that, there was a love of it. I think it was a good game for them, entertaining them, like chess, backgammon, etc.
And it included women too. So
Yes.
it's not, you
Yes.
don't have to be madrasa educated to write poetry. You don't have to have like institutional background or administrative positions. You can be a poet. So that's probably
You needed some education,
Yes,
but I mean, yes.
but you don't have to go to madrasa.
No,
Usually, that's what I get. This question I hear all the time. So how were they educated? People always think that they needed to go through madrasa education. No,
There
you
was
don't.
no
Yeah.
courses on poetry.
No, yeah, but you can be
there
a
was
poet.
language, yeah.
So yeah.
So join me in thanking Didem, Selim, and Oscar for their time with us today.